If you want to run a Kubernetes cluster locally on your Mac, then Kind has always been the best option. But earlier this year, the Docker team announced that you can use Docker Desktop to run a Kubernetes cluster using Kind. So does that mean that standalone Kind is now obsolete? Well, not quite. In fact, let's go through them both. But before we do that, go ahead and be one of the few viewers that hits the subscribe button so that more people can find this content. If you already have Docker Desktop installed, then setting up Kubernetes is as simple as going into the settings, clicking on the Kubernetes tab and turning it on. This also lets you change the Kubernetes version and increase the amount of nodes. And if you don't have kubectl installed, then this process will install it for you. With standalone Kind, you'll have to install kubectl separately. And to set up multiple nodes, you'll have to create a Kind configuration file where each node is a role. But you could give each node a different version of Kubernetes, or you can set a global Kubernetes version when you're creating your cluster. So Docker Desktop wins for ease of installation. Kind in Docker Desktop exists inside the Docker VM, whereas standalone Kind has a more direct relationship with your host system. This potentially means that it uses less resources. However, the way Kind is set up in Docker Desktop has advantages when it comes to pulling images. Let me show you. You can see we have a manifest file for a front-end pod that needs the MyApp front-end image, and similarly, we have one for the back-end pod, which uses the MyApp back-end image. Both of these images have been built inside Docker, but they don't exist inside the Docker Desktop control plane, which means the Kubernetes cluster won't be able to see them. But if we apply those manifest files and then check the control plane, we can see that Docker has automatically added those images. So both the pods are running correctly. But with standalone Kind, this won't work because you have to manually add each image to the control plane, which could take a lot of time if you have loads of images. So Docker Desktop also wins when it comes to handling images. We've already seen that Kind for Docker Desktop and standalone Kind have multi-node support, but only Kind has support for multiple clusters. You could argue that multiple nodes are used way more often than multiple clusters, so that's an unnecessary feature. But if you are after that feature, then it's nice to know that Kind supports it. In fact, standalone Kind wins in general for flexibility because you can customize your cluster using a config file, which allows you to add extra mounts for persistent storage and extra port mappings to match the container port to the host, which makes it easier to set up network components like Ingress Nginx. Currently, Docker Desktop manages cluster creation internally, so you can't really customize it, which is a shame. Because Kind in Docker Desktop is limited to the Docker VM, it shares resources with all the Docker components. So if you have a lot of images, a lot of containers, and a lot of volumes, adding a Kubernetes cluster to the mix could take up more space. Not to mention if you're adding components like Istio, then this could take up way more resources. Standalone Kind uses the same resources as your host machine, so there's no need to go fiddling around with resource management if your machine can handle the load. So, which one wins? Well, it depends. I think if you already have Docker Desktop installed, then using it for Kubernetes is a no-brainer. But if you want more control over your cluster and want multi-cluster support, or want to test your cluster in a CI/CD environment, then go with standalone Kind.